Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
On this day, 22nd of October 1962, President Kennedy made an address to the nation explaining that the Soviet Union had based missiles in Cuba. This was the beginning of the famous 13 days. 13 days of crisis, which eventually led to the Soviets agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, and the Americans secretly would withdraw their missiles from Turkey and Italy. Now, this is probably one of the closest that we have come to nuclear war. And it must have been quite terrifying on that day to be watching the telly and to see this happening in front of you. The crisis started many months before, however, and it started in a different part of the world, in Berlin. Berlin was always more important than Cuba. Berlin was the linchpin of the Western Alliance's hold on Western Europe and its defense against the Soviet Union. Berlin gave it a pocket of land deep inside the communist bloc, a place where they could broadcast and into places like Poland most of East Germany, as well as a good place for spying. Because the treaty at the end of the war between the powers meant that British, American, and French servicemen could freely go into East Berlin, and Soviet soldiers had also the right to go into West Berlin, which is why Soviet soldiers loved being posted to East Berlin. They could go and get all the goodies in the West and have a great time. And the Westerners loved it because they had West Berlin, but East Berlin was so cheap. And if you got the East German, the Ostmark, on the black market, you could have a great time over in the East, drinking and eating and having a laugh. So this was a weak point for the Soviets. They didn't like it. They wanted it to go away. Khrushchev was hoping to push the West out of Berlin. In early 1961, the Berlin Wall was being constructed. This was an attempt to prevent the brain drain from East Germany. And it was just too dangerous. You couldn't allow anyone from the Eastern Bloc to travel to East Germany because they were always afraid that they would just walk across the border into West Berlin and claim asylum, which many hundreds of thousands of people did. So this had to be stopped. The Berlin Wall was a great idea by the East, although it was also an admission of just how bad things were on their side. PR-wise, it wasn't very good, but they had to do it. But even with the wall, servicemen on each side had the right, as long as they were in full uniform, to walk into whichever sector they wished. Again, it's still too open for Khrushchev. So, Khrushchev is looking at Turkey, where there are nukes, American nukes. He's looking at Italy with American nukes. Britain has them as well. France has its own as well. Britain has their own nukes. France has their own nukes, but they also have American nukes on their soil, although de Gaulle got rid of them when he got into power. So he decides, let's talk to Castro. Castro has only been in power since '59, and he's trying to convince him to allow the Soviets to put their nukes on Cuba. If they put their nukes on Cuba, they would have a tactical advantage against the United States. Well, they would, not an advantage, they would equalize things, because the Americans already could hit deep into the Soviet Union. The Soviets could only hit Alaska and parts of Canada, most of which was empty. They couldn't hit the mainland United States. With Cuba, they could hit most of the East Coast, most of the South and Midwest. That would give them a negotiating tactic. And he was thinking, Khrushchev was thinking, if this comes out, he's willing to take the missiles out of Cuba if the West gives him West Berlin. Then there'd be no hole in the Eastern Bloc, and East Germany would be much more secure. Khrushchev thought of Kennedy as weak. He saw him as weak because of what happened in the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. Kennedy had just come to power at that point. He'd been elected in 1960. In January he was inaugurated. So this was an inherited scheme from Eisenhower. He refused the Air Force backup, and so it was a disaster. And also in Berlin, he couldn't really do much about the wall going up, but Khrushchev saw both of those things as weaknesses. So, Khrushchev's idea to rebalance the power between them led to him suggesting to Castro, let's put missiles in Cuba, which he accepted. He was reluctant at first, but he accepted. Now they started doing it in August 1962, so a couple of months before they were found out. And in August, the Americans noticed suspicious activity happening in Cuba. The Americans were told by the Soviets, this is nothing to be alarmed about, it is just defensive stuff. October the 14th, they had the initial U-2 flights over Cuba taking the photos. On the 15th, Kennedy was told. Robert Kennedy went to the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and he denied that there was any offensive missiles in Cuba. And this went on for a while. They were sending U-2 flights, taking photos. Intelligence was receiving massive amounts of intelligence from Cuba through Cuban families in Miami, talking about big trucks going through with tarpaulin covering these like missiles. Then, on the 22nd, it was decided that they had to do something. So this is when the blockade was going to be announced. They didn't say blockade because that's an act of war, they said quarantine. And when he announced it, I imagine most of the country was shocked. But this had been going on for months before. I'm sure if you know anything about this, you'll know how terrifying it must have been. Because there was an increase in pressure by both sides, of rhetoric from both sides. We saw on the 25th, Adlai Stevenson, the American ambassador to the UN, in a showdown with the Soviet ambassador to the UN, where he was demanding answers from him, and the Soviet ambassador refusing to answer. On the 26th, they went to DEFCON 2. 14 ships turned back that were going from the Soviet Union. And on the 27th, came very close to war when the Americans started depth charging the Soviet sub. The Soviet sub had nuclear-tipped missiles, and because they were out of communication, they didn't know what was going on. They thought maybe war had already started. There were 3 officers on board that needed to give consent to launch the nukes. One fella, Vasily Arkhipov, refused his consent, preventing the launch of a nuclear weapon. It came that close, and we did not even know that until 2002. So this was not widely known. At the time, there were 106 nukes on Cuba, and it was only the 22nd of November that the Soviets decided to withdraw all of their tactical nukes, because the arrangements with Kennedy didn't specify all nuclear weapons, only specified certain missiles. The Soviets at first were thinking, we'll keep it there just in case. You know, those dodgy Americans might try to come in and invade anyway. But they decided later, that might not be a good idea, because what if Castro goes crazy, takes control of them, starts lobbing them at the United States? Could cause a war. Castro was not very happy. He wanted to launch, he actually suggested launching a preemptive nuclear attack on the United States at one point. He did later, in 2010, express regret over this, and said, yeah, after everything I've seen, yeah, that wasn't worth it. But at the time, he was gung-ho for it. So, the Cuban Missile Crisis, more than meets the eye. And thankfully, Kennedy was sensible enough not to launch the invasion that his generals were urging him to do. And so we had no nuclear war, which, in my book, is a very good thing. So on this day, the 22nd of October 1962, the world becomes aware that we are on the edge of the precipice. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Subscribe, comment,